Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is that coming through? It is now. Yeah, so I'm Tim Cutfield. I'm here on behalf of the Precision Ag Association of New Zealand, but I will take this liberty to give you a bit of a brief on GPSit in the first instance. If we can go forward, here we go. So GPSit is one of New Zealand's leading agricultural mapping companies. We're based over in Tauranga. We have a plane here in Hamilton, and we have a team of guys that are out covering most of the country in terms of agricultural mapping and predominantly in the horticultural sector. We also do some mapping software development, which I'll go through in a little bit, and we also have a separate product called AgBox, which I'll also briefly mention. That was the wrong way. So the mapping business. So we have a couple of contracts. We work for Zespri predominantly and also Balance Agri-Nutrients, where we do all of the farm mapping for them. So as Will had alluded to prior, and thanks Will, you've really led into my presentation really well. We basically fly these properties with an aeroplane. We take that photographic data and we do exactly what Will does in terms of laying out mesh clouds and doing orthomosaics and coming up with digital terrain models and elevation models so that you can use that in different types of software that you may already be using. So things like the Balance My Balance Online products or the Mitigator product that they've just recently brought out, and yeah, so other applications in there. In the horticultural sector, we generally use drones, so we come down from the plains, so anything sort of up to around 80 to 90 hectares we will drone, and then over and above that we will bring the plane in. And again, the same process going through using precision GPS as well to come in and get accurate points on those properties so that we can build digital terrain models and things like that from there. And what that can result in is products like this, which is an orchard layout that we were asked to do. So we can start doing orchard design work and things like that, using the topography, starting to orientate your rows like Will was mentioning, and then basically laying out your orchard from that. So that gives you that frost protection, look at the fall of the cold air off that land. It also enables us to do quantity surveying off that. So we can tell you exactly how many posts you need, exactly how much wire you need to go on and order that with your local provider so that they aren't caught short or caught on the hop when you come in and try and order 2,500 posts. So that's one of the products that we offer. We also do software development. This tends to focus on the mapping side, mapping software. So solutions for the likes of Fonterra, Balance again. We also do work with the regional councils, and we've even done work here for Field Days. So the Field Days app, that if you were here for the main Field Days, that Field Days app was actually developed by us and delivered through it. So we also do all of the set-out work and things like that, so we can go out and actually lay out on the land where those sites should be. So if you had a site here for Field Days, we would have pinged the corners of it so that you knew exactly where you should be setting up your tent. The AgBox solution. AgBox solution is really around basically taking those maps that are out there from the products that we've talked about before, and actually opening them up to the grower and making those GIS tools that the big corporates have got available to them actually accessible to the end grower. So there's all the data security models and all that sort of stuff built into the background of AgBox. If you want to discuss any of those or have any queries about any of those elements, then come and join us over at Stand 31 and we'll be happy to talk some more. But the main part of my conversation today is around the Precision Agriculture Association of New Zealand and its role in the horticultural industry. So who is PANZ? PANZ was founded, it's basically an industry body. It was founded in 2013 after a bunch of industry gatherings around precision agriculture and how it was not getting the adoption that it should have. There was about 60 members of it, and they're currently a little bit fewer than that, but ultimately it's pan-sector, as I said. So there's the research agencies, there's agri-tech companies that are out there, there's farmers, and there's also some of the industry bodies or the industry associations that are in it as well. It's a subscription-funded mechanism, and it's managed by a team of volunteers, which I happen to be one of. There's a couple of other PANZ members here as well, which I'll mention at the end, and so if you've got any questions, you can come and seek us out later on. So the vision for PANZ was to basically enhance the contribution to New Zealand from the adoption of precision agricultural practices. So not just the technology, it's the actual practices and the decisions that come from using those technologies, which is really where you get the ROI. As Will mentioned before, you've got to find the problem and then seek out the combinations of technologies that can solve for that problem, and then actually put it all into place and build it into your farm practice or your orchard practice to actually deliver the ROI. So PANZ is about advocating for that. It's about trying to create a forum to discuss the barriers to the adoption for growers and farmers and how to overcome those. And to a small part, it's around how do we then export that offshore. The strategic priorities for PANZ. So initially, well, the first part of that is setting up that set of standards. So how do you talk about ROI? How do you talk about effective hectares on a property that might be part in kiwi fruit, part in avocados, part in dairy? Or if you're talking about ROI and you're a dairy farmer and you want to potentially move into a different crop like an avocado orchard, how much land would you have to take away from your dairy farm to then go into avocados, and what's the ROI that you'd get off that? So those sort of conversations need to be had, and it needs to be pan-agriculture. So it can't just be a dairy conversation and then a kiwi fruit conversation. You need to be able to marry that up to be able to get a fair view right across the industry. There's an audit of levels of adoption of these technologies that we're looking at, and I'll go into that in a much more detail in the next little bit. And then it's about developing and executing a communications plan around awareness and understanding of precision agriculture, which obviously this presentation is part of that sort of stuff. So the development of standards. So why do we need standards? So standards are all around the interoperability of the data. It's about having a shared understanding of what that data actually means, and then it's also about lowering the cost of data integrations going forward. So the standards work that has been done has generally been very industry or sub-industry specific. So it's around dairy, or it's around the red meat sector, or a specific part of a horticultural sector. So kiwi fruit, for example, or avocados. PANZ is about how does all of those data sets actually and all of those standards actually come back together as a whole for the whole sector to benefit the conversations that are having at local government, regional government, and national government levels. So how could that affect the horticultural industry? A lot of it's around speeding up the integration and the making it easier to have different systems talking to each other. So Will mentioned, his irrigation system and having that talk with the kit on his VRI, on his centre pivot, and it's also being able to use that same data and stick it into the cab of his tractor and actually go out and dig those drains, separately. So all of those sort of data interoperability questions are around what we're trying to solve for as well. So there is a number of initiatives that are at play across the broader agricultural sector. So the Data Linker project, which is part of the Red Meat Profit Partnership and is funded by the Primary Growth Funds. That's coming to a close in terms of the funding, and now Data Linker is actually looking to go out on its own and become an entity unto itself. There's also a couple of little joint ventures that have been trying to play around in the space as well, so the likes of Aggregate. I was actually involved with that when I was at Fonterra and the establishment of that, but now it's actually going beyond just LIC and Fonterra, well, it's beyond Fonterra specifically, and it's now being opened up to the whole of the dairy sector. And so that could then dovetail in with the likes of Data Linker and things like that to actually build a much bigger ecosystem to enable this data transfer. So what's the progress that PANZ has made in this area? So PANZ was the facilitator for a sector-wide meeting in Rotorua, where we had 43 odd participants across all of the agriculture sector. That was to really flesh out what are those next steps with the Data Linker project and where does that go. And it was also to try and bring in an international flavour to it as well. So if we try and solve this just for New Zealand, when we go and try and convey that same information into Europe or into the States, for example, we need those data standards in place across the whole globe to actually be able to tell that provenance story, to be able to tell that story back to an individual farm level. So it's quite critical that these things actually pair up over time. So PANZ was taking a lead role in instigating those conversations, and they're still progressing at this stage. So yeah, they're ticking along. These things take a lot of time because there's quite a few stakeholders and there's quite a few bits of vested interest as well. So they're not quick wins for sure. Priority 2, and this is the main bit I want to focus in on today. So priority 2 is around a industry-wide pan-agricultural audit of technology adoption. So why is this important? Basically, we need to understand across different sectors of the market where is technology being adopted and why, so that other sectors of the market, when they go through those same processes or those same environmental impacts or same environmental constraints, what is it that drives the technology? So a case in point I give here would be something like the dairy sector is getting significantly impacted by their nutrient leaching amounts at the moment. So what is the technologies that have been adopted in that sector to actually assist that and to mitigate against it, and how were they being adopted, and why were how was the farmer seeing those ROIs? If we can tell that story, and then we can come into a different sector, it might be the red meat sector, or it might even be into horticulture, how do we tell that story? What are the technologies that will actually benefit it? And how do we actually get that story in front of growers so that they actually actively adopt it? Because there is countless examples in history of great technologies that have been taken to market and they just haven't got the adoption for various different reasons. So PANZ, as a pan-industry body, basically has an independence there that can come in and say, well, it's not just dairy, this is a pan-industry issue. So if this is the bit that's happening in dairy because of that constraint, how do we tell that story in potatoes? Or how do we tell that story in pit fruit? And be able to actually leverage all of those stories across the industry to actually improve the outcomes for the industry. So what are the project objectives? We basically need to evaluate the current levels of adoption. There is a raft of research that's already gone on into the barriers to those bits of adoption. We can bring that in and influence it to help tell those stories elsewhere in the other subsectors of the industry. It's also to establish a baseline, so if we have to go back to a government body or a regulatory body in the future and say, well, look, this technology is being adopted by 20% of our farmers, we actually need a baseline to start from. So that sort of stuff is really going to be important going forward. And it also helps you as growers to get on the front foot with the media, with basically, you know, even the regulatory bodies themselves, and say, look, we are doing things to mitigate against this perceived or real constraint. Our funding objective for the project is really to source it from source funding. So being a subscription-based body, we don't have significant funds to pull on, but basically we can partner with industry bodies to do it, or industry-specific groups to do it, but we can actually play an orchestrating role across the whole sector to bring groups of that funding together to actually double down on your investment. So you'll get a lot more bang for your buck, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is some of the research that has been done in the past, which we can leverage. And the way you should look at this, and I understand you probably can't see a whole lot of it from the back of the room, but you look across the pie graphs at the bottom of this presentation, that was people's expectations before they adopted some technology. So the purple is basically, I'm expecting to be higher than where I am in whatever elements it is, profitability, environmental performance, farm performance, or climate change. Green is, I don't expect there to be any change, and blue is, I expect it to be a detriment in that specific sector. So that was the expectations of the person that was going to use the technology, and then the top line is the actual realised benefits. So you see across there that in all of the sectors, you get more benefit from using these technologies than what the perceived benefit was before you moved into it. And that matches up with what Will was talking about earlier as well. So once you get in there and you use it, you can start actually ingraining it in your business. You actually get a significant uplift of what you're doing. So there's also some studies done by Dairy NZ. They've done this over 15 odd years. It is dairy specific, and it is specific to the technologies in that dairy space. So, you know, the classics are automatic cup removers and things like that. So it might not be truly reflective of things like precision ag technologies. But ultimately, the points here are that the ROI from the adoption of those technologies greatly outweighed the investment. The payback periods were shorter than expected, and that ultimately the profitability moved, or the productivity moved. So you might have automatic cup removers. That actually meant that you had significantly less labour units required for that property, which actually was then used elsewhere to boost other parts of their businesses specifically. My personal observation out of that is that once the first technology was adopted, those farmers and growers became much more amenable to looking at and adopting other technologies. So it rapidly created a divide from those people that actually were open to it and adopting new technologies, and they were on that ride, versus the guys that were still staying out to the side. And they were creating a bit of a divide in the area. So for the audit, we intend to ensure that we're covering a representative sample of all of the different subsectors. So it'll be both regionally and subsector based, so the dairy, the dry stock, the horticulture, and not only just horticulture, you go into the pip fruit, you go into the berries, you go into all of those subsectors as well. So it is trying to be reflective of the whole of the industry as well. So the proposed pathway. So we've been at this now for probably 6 or 7 months in an active environment. So we've identified a number of the like-minded partners. We've got commitment from a number of them. We've got to the point now where we are getting into the match private investment commitments. We're at that stage of applying for the grants and things like that. That will then give us enough capital, which we're very confident of getting, to invest in that framework. We've got a schematic of it or a skeleton of it, but we need the industry input into it to actually get it to marry up to everyone's needs in the space. So there's the concept here is basically that we'll come up with a prototype survey, and we'll go out and sample a subsector of the market, and then we will basically iterate off that until we get it to the point where we would do the whole of the country. That's the baseline, conducting the baseline survey. So that we would aim to be doing by the end of the year, and then we will basically be rolling it out. So that's why we want to get a commitment from partners in this for a 2 to 5 year kind of time frame, so that basically as it's rolling out, it becomes part of what happens. We also understand that growers and farmers are going through survey fatigue. They're always getting surveyed about something, but we need to be able to tell that story up the front before we actually go out and do it, of why this one is actually important. So there's a lot of thinking that's gone into that. So what's our role in this? We can bring in some of that expertise at the survey design level. We can bring in the independence by being a pan-agricultural body and not fully associated with any of the other associations at the sub-level. We have a partner identified to help us with that whole framework and design. There's a whole lot of research that we're pulling out of the likes of Dairy NZ and other bodies who have done these surveys in the past, and what's the success that they've had. We can leverage all that into the model going forward. We will also be giving the publication of generalised results. So there's some of the general results that will be going out, but as an industry partner, you'll be getting a subset of a more detailed view of their findings from it. And we can also help with the funding, because we can access some other grants and some government money that isn't available at the subsector level. The partners, so these are industry partners. They will basically have their sector expertise. So what are the problems that are confronting that sector? What are the technologies that are actually out there, so that we can actually build that into the surveys? They'll also be giving us the context lists and things like that. They'll have some design input into the survey, and then they will get the deeper, richer insights out of it, so that they can use that for their own purposes. So deliverables, we've got a survey methodology, which is as I said, in skeleton format at this stage. We'll be implementing that survey later this year, and that will be tested with a prototype of it within different sectors to ensure that we can get replicability going over time. We will do all of the data collection and the processing, and we will make that available to the industry partners and a subset of that to the general public. So yeah, and then it's about just the management of the whole process and delivering a broader product. So if you'd like to find out any more about that, you can come find myself. As I said, I'm on site 31. Next to me on site 32 is Sophie at the Lincoln Agritech site, and Dan, who's also out in the audience here, is available as well if you'd like to have a chat with him. And on that, I think I shall wrap up.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. With all this technology talk, I'd love you to take away your horticulture tractor. Have fun with that. But really interesting in terms of our food future. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Cutfield.
Thank you.